Hello, thanks for stopping by. Today's video is a cross-country flight to Terre Haute Regional Airport, or KHUF. Today I made the decision to go to Terre Haute because I'd never been and I wanted to check it out, and because the winds were slightly nice there compared to other cross-country worthy airports. Winds were a little higher the day I filmed this, 18 gusting 17 at Lafayette, and I was excited to use crosswind corrections to get better at it. However, it took a while for the fuel truck to get around to filling me up, so by the time I took off, around 6, the winds had died down to 9 knots at 20 degrees from runway heading. So I got to use a little bit of crosswind correction, but not as much as I had hoped. I decided to get flight following for this cross-country trip, since Terre Haute is Class D and is manned 24 hours, plus I thought it'd be a good exercise on picking up flight following. Everything was all good on the climb out to Terre Haute, except for the GoPro falling again, and a little bit of task saturation as I was transferred between controllers. Cruise to Terre Haute was fine, except that the plane liked to roll a little bit to the right and defaults to negative 100 feet per minute on the vertical speed indicator, so I had a little trouble maintaining straight course and steady altitude. The approach to Terre Haute was pretty bad, since I didn't really see the runway they assigned me. I ended up spotting the flashing lights at the end of runway 23 instead of 32, but the controller was very nice and let me change to runway 23 since the winds were fairly low. The landing to Terre Haute was decent, and I was fairly satisfied with it. There was a little bit of confusion on the taxiing, as the controller initially told me to go to taxiway Foxtrot, but then told me to turn left on Alpha 1 as if he never said Foxtrot. I didn't really care, and I complied like a good boy. I then asked to taxi back so I could get back to Lafayette. The controller was very nice and didn't seem to mind that I kept asking which taxiways to use. By the time I got to the end of runway 32, I noticed that the attitude indicator was very, very wrong. It was indicating me in a 20-degree pitch up and a significant left bank despite being on the ground. This was not good at all, since the attitude indicator is pretty much the only thing that would keep me from being spatially disoriented at night, and is required for night flight, or for day flight, for that matter. So this being all messed up was pretty serious. After my initial confusion, I radioed the tower that I'd be troubleshooting and went into problem-solving mode. This was the first time something was seriously wrong, and my initial thought was not slight panic, and I'm quite proud of that. Once my brain went into problem-solving mode, I recognized that the attitude indicator is powered by gyroscopes and the engine-driven vacuum pump. I immediately turned my attention to the suction indicator, and it was reading quite low for a standard taxiing RPM of 1000. My first thought was that maybe the RPMs were just too low, and that it'd be fixed if I went to a higher RPM, which is why you see me increase the RPMs here. This did increase the suction pressure to be within the green range and caused the attitude indicator to be corrected somewhat, but it was still miles off from what it needed to be. So I increased my RPMs again to about 1700, or the run-up speed, and the attitude indicator mostly corrected itself. But I wasn't completely satisfied with the attitude indicator just yet, so I asked the tower to let me taxi back somewhere so I could shut down the plane and get it back up again to see if that fixed the issue. The kind controller let me do a 180 at the runway hold short line and taxi back to the run-up area just behind the runway to shut down the plane. I did so, and I got it back up. As the suction went away, the attitude indicator went all wonky again, but that's to be expected when you shut down the plane. But it seemed okay when I got the plane back up and running, though it still wasn't perfect. I decided that I shouldn't have the engine below approximately 1300 RPM if I don't want the attitude indicator to be all wonky and weird. So I contacted the tower again and asked to do one pattern at Terre Haute to make sure everything was okay. I did my one pattern to a full stop. The pause was to get me a full stop landing at night and to check the attitude indicator. The attitude indicator checked out, and I decided to take off again and head back home. As I was in the air on the way home, I realized that I should have taken pictures or video of the wonky attitude indicator both for you and for Purdue Aviation to see. But I was too laser focused on getting the problem solved and getting back home to do that. So much so that I forgot to change the GoPro battery as well, which I ended up doing that in flight anyway. On the way out, I canceled my flight following because I knew the airport I was going to, and I didn't want to have the task saturation impede my ability to pilot the plane, should the attitude indicator go crazy in flight. I really just didn't want to be switching in between frequencies so much. But I kept myself on Terre Haute's departure frequency so I could make a distress call if need be. I also made sure to keep an eye out for potential landing spots, should the engine go out for any reason, which I really should have been doing already anyway, but even though a bum attitude indicator or vacuum pump really wouldn't have caused an engine to go out, my heightened sense of self-preservation due to the issues with the attitude indicator really caused me to do this. But I know in the future I'll definitely be doing this more often now, as it's just a good practice to do. My first approach to Lafayette was nothing special, but the landing was a little off. I floated down the runway quite a bit, and when I landed it kind of felt like I blew a tire or slid a bit, but I definitely blow a tire because it wasn't a major yaw in either direction. I blame differential braking on this one. I also recognized that I floated down the runway a lot, probably because the winds were calm and I had a slight tailwind. This makes sense since I typically land at 65 knots as a buffer, but in this case it was just a little bit of extra speed caused me to float down quite a bit. I did a full stop and taxi back to runway 23 to make another lap around the pattern. This time I turned final way too early, but I managed to get my airspeed down to 60 knots on final and I didn't float as much. I'm quite happy with this landing overall. This one I made a stop and go on, and once I got back up into the pattern, I was told to change from left to right traffic on this last pattern. It was kind of cool getting to fly over campus this time, but it was a little difficult to keep track of the runway since I hadn't flown right traffic on 2-3 at night, and plus runway 2-3's lights are a little dim. But I managed to make a decent pattern and came in for a nice landing. I taxied back to parking, and after I got back in, I filed a discrepancy report for the attitude indicator. If this flight taught me anything, it's to always keep a cool head and to not to panic when something goes wrong. I'm glad I didn't panic, and that my level of thinking got me back home. Thanks for watching.